So, as I'm sure you all know, once upon a time, we thought the world was flat. And that was ultimately rooted in a limitation in perception. So, it certainly looks kind of flat from the ground looking out as far as your eyes are capable of. And we logically came to the conclusion that the world was in fact round before we could verify that with taking pictures of it in the sky. And so from those pictures, here's kind of what we came up with, right? Is this the world as it really is? Does it really look like this? When I look at a globe like this, as a perception scientist, one of the first things that strikes me is that the world really has to be more beautiful, more awesome, more amazing than I can see. Because I know that there's only so many colors that I can see, so many variations in hue. There's even only so many kinds of lines and orientations I can see. They have to be so thick in order to stimulate cells in my eye, right? There's limitations to what I'm capable of perceiving that limit the richness with which I'm able to experience this thing called the world. And so one of the things that I always like to sort of dream about as a perception scientist is how much more beautiful is the world than I know. And when I look at things like this, and this is important as a scientist in general, but as a perception scientist, I think it hits home even more. How wrong is my understanding of it all? How off is my conception of the world because I can only see so much of it, and I've come to conclusions that only take that kind of information into account. And it's important to keep that kind of limitation in mind even when you look at something like a globe. Why? Because I can create computer technology to do all kinds of amazing things, including shooting it up into outer space, pointing it down at the world, zooming it in, and taking pictures with the kind of exquisite detail that would allow me to figure out the borders of different countries and the elevation of different mountains, which you can actually feel on this globe here. It's kind of raised up, which is pretty cool. But I can only create machines to look for what I know to look for, because that's the only way I can figure out whether it did it right or not. And what I know to look for is obviously heavily colored by my perception. It doesn't mean that I can't program a machine to detect something that I can't. So we can measure infrared light even though we can't see it. And it can cause you cancer, so we know it's a thing. And that's one of the reasons why you wear sunscreen. So it's not that it's impossible, but we are ultimately limiting the questions we ask based on what we know to ask. What we know to ask is colored heavily by what we experience perceptually. And so that's kind of one of the things that I think about when I think about perception science and when I look at a globe like this. Because interestingly, right, there's interesting debates, even about this globe right here, in terms of what it really truly looks like, the world that this is represented in format. Does it have the exact shape that it does? Because this is, I'm assuming based on when this globe was made, based off of a veridical interpretation. So we basically take the light that hits the camera and we take it at face value. But perception scientists have later kind of begun wondering how the light's actually distorted as it travels from the world to the camera. So it bounces, it originates from the sun, bounces off of the physical space that we call Earth, and back at the camera. And as it does that, that light can get distorted in certain ways based off of the atmosphere that it has to travel through, and the specific real shape of the world, not the shape of the world that hits as reflected in the lens of the camera. And so, if you understand in more detail how light varies with space and topography, you begin to realize that you're actually getting a slightly warped version of the world as projected into a camera that we place in outer space. And so, if you think about principles of perception science, and specifically principles of light and how that influences your perception, you begin to realize that this globe right here is actually a distorted view of the world. And so we've since corrected that a little bit in more modern depictions of the world. But I can almost promise you that those modern depictions are still quite wrong. I don't know how wrong they are. I will never know how wrong they are. But it sure does make you wonder, doesn't it? And I hope you leave this course with that kind of sense of wonderment every time you look at something. And that you realize when you look at a globe like this, a representation of your world, don't take it at face value. There's probably a lot of truth to it. I mean, you can make predictions based off of this that can be borne out, so I'm certainly not saying it's useless. But don't take it at face value. It's ultimately fundamentally limited because it's only what we can see, and more to the point, it's only what we can interpret about what we see. And that's distorted in a lot of ways, and it's incomplete in a lot of ways. There are certain things that I can't see, and there's different ways that, say in this case for vision, light can be reflected off of things that can distort the information that gets sent to something like a computer. So don't take it at face value. It's probably not just more different than what you think it is, but it's more beautiful and awesome. I'm going to hazard a guess.